silico is, especially in the medical field, quite a new thing. For example, performance safety issues, like generating evidence. It's quite a new step in comparison to in vitro or in vivo study.
How do you actually validate a simulation model in the medical space?
Once you want to start a simulation, it's always not only a good thing, it's actually sort of mandatory to look on verification and validation of the model itself you want to utilize.
How do you feel the topic of in silico will evolve in the next 5 to 10 years?
Like strength assessment on patient-specific devices, that's the thing you can hardly do with the traditional approaches. So for every single adopted and individualized device, and there I see simulation as the tool to go for. And that's something I would see that started already. A forecast, I would say, coming from the FDA and MDIC. Maybe at some point you can entirely replace in vitro tests by simulation.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, today I have a very special guest on my show, namely Sven Hermann from SimQ. Today we'll talk about digital twins, but not for engineering applications solely, but also for the, or more particularly, I should say, for the medical space. So Sven, welcome to the show.
Hi everyone, thank you, Josef, for being here. Yeah.
Really cool. I think before we get started, Sven, give us a brief introduction of what you do at SimQ. What is your background? And go for it.
Yeah, so I guess I would start with my background. So because basically my background is pretty strong in biomechanics. So I originally studied mechanical engineering, but then I went into research, biomechanical research in a clinic in Rostock, and did my PhD there. And afterwards, I did also like a postdoc phase in Murnau, which is south of Munich. So in both stations, I focused pretty much on simulation, mostly on orthopedics, but also on the trauma side. And that's my background. That's the reason why I joined basically SimQ about 4 years ago when they had an open position. And here I'm now responsible for the seminars and consulting part. So mainly focusing on doing consulting projects together with customers, usually applying simulation tools with their application, basically, usually implants, a lot of biomechanical things and so on.
Yeah,
Yes,
sounds really
that's
exciting.
from my side.
Yeah, really, really cool. I think when we talk about V&V, so verification and validation, which we'll talk about extensively during this podcast, I think we also have to talk about some of the terms that you guys are defining or very extensively also on your blog, like in vivo, in vitro, and then obviously in silico. So what do these terms actually mean, and how would you define the verification and validation process, and how it differs from the classical, I would say, engineering approach?
Yeah, so I mean, those are specific terms coming from the clinical side, I would say, especially in vitro and in vivo. So in vivo means in the living being, I would say. So that's how I would translate it. So usually, if you look on an implant and you say, I want to look at it from the in vivo side, you look at really in the body, so how it's performing in the body. In vitro is the thing when you go to your lab, basically. Like if you test. For example, what's pretty strong in the biomechanical field is cadaveric testing. So when you would want to test that in your lab, then you would call it in vitro testing. So there's actually direct translation also from Latin, but that's how I would, sort of describe them. And then the next step would be in silico. So basically doing your analysis on the computer. So if you want to look on, for example, on your implant, how it's performing, you don't go in your lab, you don't sort of do measurements on an actual patient, you actually try to reproduce it on your computer and then try to simulate, like, for example, your performance and so on, what you're interested in. So those are basically the three things now, especially in our field, we are talking about, so in vivo, in vitro, and in silico. And in silico is, I would say, especially in the medical field, quite a new thing. Sure, they're like in research, started like a couple of decades ago, I would say, and a couple of companies also like took it over. But on a broader side, I would say that's like a new thing, especially to evaluate, for example, performance safety issues, also like generating evidence. Then it's quite a new step in comparison to in vitro or in vivo study. So especially like if you look in vivo, I would say the standard pretty much in the clinical field is clinical trials or clinical studies. So that's, I would say, most of the people in this field would have, like come close to this term at least. So like in the clinical study field. But I would say in silico is quite new to those guys then. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So would you say the in silico part is the more modern part, I would say, but then the in vivo and in vitro part is more like the traditional approach. Is that how we
Yes.
can?
So especially if you go, I mean, if you come from a medical product, I would say, or perspective, and you want to generate evidence for your documentation, then like in vivo testing, like clinical trials, or in vitro testing, those would be like the traditional approaches you would utilize to generate evidence, for your documentation. And in this regard, I would say in silico is quite an not really new, completely new, but like over the last 5 years, I would say, or 6 years, it's actually started that you can utilize that. So which is quite a new technique, at least in the medical device field when it comes, to evidence generation. From, of course, the engineering field, that's not nothing new. I mean, simulation, final element simulation, and so on. That's something which I would say nowadays every engineer would know, at least like had to one or two lectures so back at the university, and in different like engineering applications, automotive and so on. That's like status quo. So people in those companies would apply it all the time. But in the medical device industry, I would say that's something which has not like fully embraced, I would say, in the
I
complete
see.
field. Yeah.
Yeah. What would you say are some of the limitation and challenges maybe with the quote unquote traditional approaches?
Yeah, sure. They're like, of course, and like every technique or every approach you use has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, I would say. Like,
Mhm,
of course, if you want to go actually validate your product, sure. I mean, the traditional approach going into a clinical trial, that's how you see how the actual performance of the device is and whether, what you state the treatment would look like and the device would fulfill in terms of treatment. That's
mhm,
how you can actually prove it. And this is something I would say uh, which you can do with simulation also. Um, but for sure, what you see on the in vivo side is you have certain limitations. So, like one, of course, is like the time. It's hard to recruit that many patients in a certain time frame. And the other thing is also like you cannot recruit every patient, so you're limited to a certain cohort size. And for example, your outliers, if you want to see, okay, want to have certain, like patients with certain attributes, like say height, weight, gender, age difference, whether it's a younger one or older one, that's something you can hardly control. And if you want to control it, it takes a long time for recruitment. And those are things actually, even in this field, you see already the strength of simulation because there are some approaches you can utilize sort of to cover the population you want to look at using certain like tools to sort of reproduce that on a computer. If you look on maybe on the in vitro part, sure, you still have the physical test. So you're in the lab, you're looking on your device, you can actually see how it performs, at least in your setup, which is also sort of like a limitation because I mean you're restricted to certain measurements. Of course, you cannot fully look in your device like from every aspect because you're limited what your measurements are saying or what you're telling you. Um, Also, like certain repetitions are not possible. That applies also like for the in vivo part. So if you want to look on the same like setup and say, wait a sec, now I implanted the device in this bone, for example, and now I want to shift it or reposition it. That's not possible. You plugged it in already in the patient for sure. It's not possible. But also
mhm.
if you do cadaveric testing where you have decay issues, then certain things are not possible anymore. So it's not reversible. And those are things you can quite easily do on the computer side again. Like you have your setup reproduced. So let's look at a couple of parameters. Let's take a different size, although it's the same bone, although it's the same patient or patient replication, and do some variations on that. And that's, I would say, the most important strength of like computer simulation or in silico approaches, that you can reproduce it. You can endlessly, like play with your parameters. Um, at the same time, that might be like a shortcoming of simulation, that of course it can take some time doing the simulation all the time if you have lots of parameters, and if the model gets complex, so you have to know whether the model is performing in the right way, so you have to do validation activities. So there might be also like some time involved to actually like provide a good model that you can trust, and like that you can say that's credible enough for the utilization, or for the things I want to look at.
Yeah.
So that's like maybe a rough overview of maybe some limitations and strength and weakness for all the approaches. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you, I'm not aware of any of that, like how that works, on all of the details involved, but how do you actually validate a simulation model in the medical space? Like, let's say you perform a simulation, let's say an FE simulation, for example, for a specific body part, a bone. How would you validate that? Are there some specific guidelines from the FDA, or how does it actually work?
hmm So yes, so there are a couple of things to say about that. So for sure, you know product verification and validation. And the same applies for the model itself. So once you want to start a simulation, it's always not only a good thing, it's actually sort of mandatory to look on verification and validation of the model itself you want to utilize.
Hmm.
And for that, for example, there are certain guidelines out there, also like provided even by the FDA itself. So, and the whole thing is about model credibility. So those activities you should perform about verification validation of the model, they are aiming at providing sufficient model credibility so that you can trust the model in what it's actually doing. Because the use of the model is actually a sort of a prediction. You want to predict, how your implant is performing, for example, in a test or maybe in a patient, and that's the thing you should at least show that the predictions are valid enough or that they are trustworthy. And that's the thing you would do in those validation activities. So, and maybe one thing to understand what verification validation means. So verification in terms of model verification just means you look at the code you're having and whether the code is, like solved correctly. So, like algorithm, does it what you want to do actually? Does it mathematically calculate it correctly? Validation rather means whether you actually, set up the correct model to look at the phenomena you want to look at, or that it's able to solve that. So it's on the equation side whether you selected the right equations. So it's not about proving physics. I mean, physics law is there. It's just
Hmm.
that you, for example, if you want to look on bone, that you didn't utilize some, like fluid mechanics to model a solid structure, for example, like to make it clear what it means. And that's something you would do then in those validation activities. So for example, coming back to your bone example, what you would most likely do is like having a benchtop test, which, like for example, compresses a bone and then try to reproduce that in your model. And that would show that you can actually reproduce with all the assumptions you have in the model, a good, or have a good replication of the bone in your model already. So that would be maybe one first step. If you want to then do an implantation, then maybe you can, to show it, that it performs well, do your test with an implant together with a bone and then replicate it in the model. And so step by step, sort of come up with a credible model. Because then once you did it, then of course, once you did it with one device, then you can, like do the variations with another device in the model, because you already showed it for one device that it works.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense. I also like, Sven, that you make the distinguishment between verification and validation, because I think sometimes people mix them up and they
yeah.
don't actually know what that means. Um, I'm wondering, like, in this whole concept that we just discussed, verification, validation, and everything you've explained before, where does the concept of the digital twin fit in? And is
Mhm.
the definition of a digital twin different to what we're used to in classical mechanical engineering? Like, how do you guys define the digital twin in the medical space?
Yeah. Uh, so I wouldn't say that it's completely different from the engineering field. So you can actually say it's always a replication of what you want to look at, but an entire replication on the computer. So let's say if you want to look on a patient side, you really try to replicate the whole patient, at least like from a mechanical perspective and what you're looking
Mhm.
at on your computer. And that's like a digital twin. It can but also mean that you have, for example, a norm test, a standard test, which you do all the time in your lab, and but now you do want to do some variation, or you want to actually save some time and do a full replication of what the test is doing on the computer. So meaning, for example, what I've always in mind is like a 4-point bending test of a plate.
Mhm.
Um, so you just apply the forces and the loads as if it were in a test. You just replicate the whole thing on the computer, and that would be like a digital twin, especially if you know like to conduct the whole analysis um, of it. So it rather depends on the application. So from our side, what we see as digital twin approaches is would be like three things. Let's say so one thing would be you replicate that standard tests. The other thing, you want to replicate a complete patient. That would be a so-called patient-specific simulation. And the third one would be you want to actually look on cohorts and populations, and that would be virtual cohorts, or we call it, I think, internally synthetic patients, which is more like a general approach where you say, okay, I'm not interested in a single patient, but on an entire population, maybe 1,000, 10,000 patients, and some certain characteristics they share, and certain outcomes you want to look at.
Mhm. That goes
So,
back to sorry for interrupting, but I think
mm,
that goes back to statistical modeling, right? Because I think you guys are very strong at like thought leaders, but also action leaders in the sense of like we want to provide personalized medicine simulations
mhm,
for patients or like for, let's say, doctors who want to use your technology.
yeah,
So you need some specific statistics on, let's say, a distribution of a specific cohort, right? Is that
yeah.
already included in your software? Do you have that data? Is it like hidden somewhere, or is it publicly accessible? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so I would say the technique itself is publicly available because it has been done a lot in research. So,
Mhm.
so if you want to look at a population side, so what you usually do is statistical shape modeling. So, which is on the geometry side. So, for example, if you want to, let's take a bone example again, and you have different shapes of bones across your population, then you can use this. It's a sort of statistical analysis to come up with a standardized model, which is
Mhm.
fully parameterized. But the parameters are related to the population you're looking at, and so that the actual shape of the bone, can be adopted throughout this entire population. And
Got it.
that's how you can generate, although maybe you used maybe just 10 or 20 or 100 patients to sort of train this sort of model, to come up with this statistical shape model.
Mhm.
But out of that, you can generate 1,000, 10,000, which share the attributes of the population you had earlier in the training. And this is like the basis on the geometry side. And once you have the geometry side done, then you can easily, even in an automated process, depending on what you want to look at, generate your simulations. And that's specifically strong when you want to test, for example, or check a device, the performance of the device across a population. Whereas when you want to go into the clinical side, you can also use these techniques to if you have lack of information, for example, to utilize those techniques to identify a certain geometry for patients where you have, for example, only half the bone available all of a sudden, because sometimes you receive CT data or MRI data which doesn't show the whole body or the whole part or whole anatomy you're actually interested in. And those are the techniques, so like statistical shape model or other techniques, also like using maybe AI, so like AI techniques to sort of reconstruct and segment the geometry, so that you can come up with a patient-specific model which actually tries to replicate the specific patient the clinician or the doctor is looking at.
Yeah, this
So
is super interesting.
uh,
Yeah. How do you actually, like, let's say we go from the beginning to the end, like kind of the step-by-step process of pre-processing, processing,
mm,
post-processing. Like, how would someone go about like uploading their own CAD model? Like, how would that work? Let's say I'm a customer, at
mm.
SimQ. How would I go about like using your tools, for example?
Okay, it definitely pretty much depends whether you do a consulting project with me or want to use the software itself. Um,
How do they
so
differ, by the way? I think it's good that you make the distinguishment.
yeah,
So how does that differ? Let's say I'm going to use your software or I want to have a consulting project with you. Like, how do
yeah,
these two things differ? Or are there like, is there like some synergy effects between those? Like, how does
yeah.
that work?
So obviously, I mean, the best would be there are some synergy effects. So, so consulting could be like anything, you know, like in terms of you have a certain question you want to look at, and we then answer that with using simulation tools, basically, and that's rather can be rather independent from our solutions. So could be anything, you know, like for example, I want to reproduce a benchtop. Please generate the model for me and do some analysis we're interested in, for example, fatigue analysis or strength assessments or worst case assessments, something like that. And then we can do it apart from the simulation. What we usually would receive is just the geometry data. It can be MRI data, CD data, if it's like a patient or some anatomy input, but of course, like normal geometry data from CAD software. Whereas, and this is like the consulting part. It can also include that we internally would utilize our solutions. You know, like for example, the VIT tool, if it suits the application or if it suits the question at hand. Um, the solution part is like a different side because there it also depends on like the question or the workflow itself, and then it can be sometimes MRI data. It can be also like CT data,
Mm-hmm.
or for example, the VIT tool. I think it also like demands certain geometry inputs, so like STL files, where at least the bone is there and the implant is there, and this is what the customer can then actually load him or herself into the software and do like the first step in there. But that's something like from the input side, like for those solutions, it pretty much depends, like on what, like module you're looking at, or like what question is resolved by this solution, because this sort of pretty much defines also like the input the user has to like utilize, whether it's an STL geometry from the implant, or whether it already starts like on the CT basis, so that you just have to upload the CT into the software, and then with a few registration clicks you have a reconstruction. For example, this is utilized in the SimQ also, which is like the sleep apnea application. There we have, for example, CT data as an input, whereas in the VIT tool, where you actually look at a strength assessment of a patient-specific implant, there you have the geometry upload as STL.
Mm, got it. That makes sense.
Mm.
I'm wondering, there's some competitors that you guys have also in the market who use this kind of in silico technology. Where do you differentiate yourself from the competition in terms of like we talked about statistical shape modeling, AI,
Yeah,
AI assisted simulations, for example, that sort of stuff. So, because I think the benefits of simulation are quite clear in terms of like less iterations, like all the things we
yeah,
know as engineers with how simulation benefits us. But how do you guys differ from the rest of the competitors in the market?
yeah.
I know I'm
So
putting
I
you on
mean,
the spot here. I'm putting you on the spot here, but I would like to know.
yeah, that's true. I mean, that's something like market evaluation. I would say it's also like uh, all the time, also like our thing, like because we see ourselves actually as pioneers. And when you look closely, I mean, I did the research like I guess 1 year or 2 years ago, even for an article, which hopefully at some point will come up and will be published. And there are not that many companies out there yet
Mhm.
who actually do those things what we do, because we want to like bring simulation in at least semi-automatic way or semi-automatic workflow even to clinicians, so that they can utilize simulation for the decision making. So that's one point. Of course, there are also like I would say workflows which can be utilized by manufacturers. That's like, for example, the VIT tool.
Yeah.
And having this idea like on a broad base, I would say that distinguishes us from others, because most of them right now out there, they have like one specific clinical question, and for that they like produce their workflow. So I know a couple of, well, let's say 2 or 3 companies out there focusing on cardiovascular I would say clinical questions,
Hmm.
and they trim their workflow for answering that. Sure, for sure, from that they will also want to have it, like covered for maybe a couple of more medical devices, not only the hard area, for example. But they started from there, and we're rather independent from the question itself, because we approach it more from a platform side. So what we did like a couple of years ago is starting like generating a general platform, and depending on the question you have from the clinical side, we can plug onto this platform the module which actually answers this question within a workflow. So meaning the sleep apnea, for example, would be like the clinical question. Okay, is there something you can look from the mechanical side to have a certain index and say, okay, when the index, for example, has this number, then you should intervene or should do something. And this is like the clinical question, and we generated a workflow for that uh, in as a module in within onto this platform.
So
Whereas
so
VIT is like
it's kind of like a template that people can use and reuse.
sort of. I mean, I guess the idea was, or maybe still is, that maybe also like others would utilize the platform and come up with their own workflows.
Hmm.
But we for sure internally, from the development side, would use it, that we have like one basic platform where for example the GUI, graphic user interface, or like all everything what is handled in the backend, that this is standardized at least across like the entire solution branch or products. But then when like customers have specific questions, for example, I want to look at strength assessment from a patient-specific implant, or another one would be like, okay, now I want to utilize standardized plates, but have a question of pre-bending them before I implant them, and how to position them to treat a fracture, and how do they, like how are they stressed then under biomechanical loading. That's, for example, a tool we're currently developing, the OSP tool, looking at the osteosynthesis. So then we are rather free to answer those questions within the workflow.
Yeah.
And as you see, we have a couple of different ones, not only focusing maybe on one clinical phenomena or one clinical question, for example, only on cardiovascular, and also like maybe another application would be like fracture assessment of femora, or of a femora, for example, which is a specific question. But there's a company like establishing something on that. But this is something we can also cover using this platform approach, I would say. Yeah.
We haven't talked about KPIs so much, Sven. So I was wondering, like in the classical V cycle, like when you go from the ideation and user requirement specification phase up to when the product has been validated, how long does it roughly take? Um, as compared to when you front load, for example, the development process with a tool like yours.
Yeah, it pretty much depends. So you mean like when the from scratch until market? You mean
Correct,
this
correct,
time frame?
correct. Yeah.
So I saw numbers up to 7 years, 5 to 7 years. It pretty much depends, maybe on the product itself, or who is actually, like telling this number, I would say, or publishing this number. Um, but this is something interesting, and this is something maybe related also like to these virtual cohorts, and maybe that's a reason why this is now getting bigger and bigger. And I think in the future, that's I would say a really big thing, because this has the potential to cut down one of the crucial times, which is the validation process, meaning clinical trials. this is something which takes up a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have 7 years of until the market, so I would say maybe half of it. Okay, I'm not an expert in clinical studies, but at least when you look at the figures, could be that half of it is just like the clinical trial at the end. So like actually verifying and validating the whole thing. And I saw numbers that you maybe can trim that down by 2 years using only in this aspect. So like in the validation aspect, those clinical um, virtual cohorts, I would say, to either augment the clinical trials or maybe it's some future to even entirely replace it. This is only one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, if you maybe can trim down your development cycle. And I think there, maybe for some companies who don't utilize simulation at all, that might be the first step. Like look at your development. Are there certain verification tests you have to sort of, like to comply with or to fulfill? Why not optimizing your product right away for them using the computer? That's the
Yeah.
thing I don't understand.
Yeah. What I also
So
don't understand is, sorry, but what I also
yeah,
don't understand is, I think the benefits of simulation are quite evident and quite clear. Like, what do you think holds people back from actually adopting your technology or like simulation in general? Is it skepticism? Is it like relying on old, outdated tool chains? Like, what is it?
yeah. So I would say it's a mixed bag there. So I would say there's some skepticism still there. I mean, just imagine if you have to sort of make the decision to say, now I hire a simulation guy, but all of a sudden you realize, okay, I need maybe computer infrastructure, I need IT infrastructure. So
Mm,
there's a certain invest you have to undertake, and you have to make, that it works, and uh, that's something for sure. When you're just used doing testing and have your infrastructure there, or your, like your test lab available. So I would say that's maybe one obstacle. Another obstacle is definitely the regulatory side. So because like, and that's also like what we see here, or also experienced with a couple of customers or a lot of customers, they're really interested in actually utilizing this technique then also for submission purposes, and actually using it as evidence in the technical documentation. And there's been, or there is, I would say, some degree of uncertainty, especially in Europe, whereas in US, I think this is not resolved entirely, but pretty much, like handled by some guidances by the FDA. So the regulatory, like basis is pretty strong in the US right now, whereas in Europe there might be some questions still to resolve until maybe a company can fully embrace simulation and say, now I use it entirely for submission, or for the like for this whole process, like bringing the product to market and verifying and validating the product using those simulation techniques. And that's, I would say, a huge obstacle still right now, especially in Europe, I would say. Um, and as I said, in the US, it's maybe not entirely resolved, but it's the FDA is really pushing forward there that you can
yeah.
utilize, and they started it even a couple of years ago. And that's what I see, especially if I see it for smaller companies and maybe middle-sized companies who haven't started, utilizing those things. That's something. So like, for example, like the skepticism, does it bring something, does it serve me well, like, and being maybe not afraid, but seeing the obstacle of actually investing in this field when you especially have this regulatory issue. That's something we're seeing quite a lot, and that's something I would say is also like similar to, different engineering fields like 20 or 30 years ago. So where there was also like skepticism, especially coming from the testing guys. Wait a second, you do simulation? Those are just generated pictures. I don't believe you. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think also a follow-up question I would have regarding regulatory requirements, like for FDA, but also
Mm,
the European commissions or entities, however you want to call them,
yeah.
is I feel it's a bit like for you guys, it must be, I wouldn't say annoying, but maybe tedious because there's so many regulations coming up. And I think America maybe does a better job in that than Europe. I'm not sure how you see it, but that
Yeah.
must be super tedious to work through that.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is, I would say we're coming on only in a hypothesis from the simulation side. But what I also heard from customers is like the whole MDR issue, that it's a lot of challenges, like just to comply right now only, like with the standard products, even products on the market. And the thing is, from the simulation side, yes, you can, by the MDR, you can utilize it, but like a notified body would not know how to handle a simulation when you like show them a report to some extent, because there are no guidances out there, or no rules, or no, how do you say, no way of them of a notified body to evaluate whether it can be trusted or not. I mean, the structure right now is like that. If you verify your product, you go to a like accredited test lab, and this accreditation of the test lab, like shows the notified body that it can trust the results. And this infrastructure is not given or not present for the simulation right now. And that's not my opinion. That's actually the feedback of a notified body. So the notified body, what they would do right now in Europe, at least what I heard in, like the environment I'm within, is that they would maybe accept some issues in terms, or some rationally in terms of worst case definitions. But once you want to utilize simulation, then they would see right away, not a red flag, but maybe, okay, what to do with that. And in this regard, the FDA, with its centralized approach, because everything in terms of admission goes through the FDA, and they have their experts there, and they are trained how to handle simulations. And the FDA itself provided guidances how to report your simulation study, so that you actually show what evidence is generated by your simulation, in a standardized manner. Because in the report, in this guidance, is specifically illustrated and highlighted, okay, what the FDA recommend you to show once you want to submit a model. And the FDA is also did a new guidance last year. It came out last year about verification and validation of a model. So they even tell you what you should provide, even in a documented form, to show that your model is credible enough. And those are like the two legs. First, you show your model is credible enough, and then you show your simulation study what evidence you're generating. And the agents are trained now, so you can submit it, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the status there. Uh, Whether you can submit everything, like in terms of high level population based analysis, that might be a different question. But at least like from the basis, the simulation is regarded as a major evidence by the FDA,
I
100%.
see. Mm-hmm. How do you see this will evolve maybe in the future? I don't want you to make a future prediction, Sven, but more like, how do you feel the topic of in silico simulations, or the topic of in silico, will evolve in the next 5 to 10 years? Especially now that we talked about AI, machine learning, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, there may be a couple of aspects to it. So what I'm pretty sure, and maybe that's the reason why I also invested in this field with the VIT tool, is that like strength assessment on patient-specific devices, that's the thing you can hardly do with the traditional approaches. So for every single adopted and individualized device, and there I see simulation is the tool to go for. Um, so that would be one thing. The other thing for sure is like the virtual court thing we talked about earlier, that you try, like to minimize your verification and validation efforts in the physical space, so to be, and bring more and more evidence, generate more and more coming from the in silico side. And that's something I would see that started already. It's at least like virtual court studies. It's something what major companies are trying already now, but maybe like in maybe 5 to 10 years, so that maybe also like other companies or other players in the field would utilize it more and more in this regard. And that's something I would say that's it's also like a forecast, I would say, coming from the FDA and MDIC, which is a medical what's it called, Medical Institute Innovation Consortium, yeah, this way. And they've sort of forecasted that maybe at some point you can entirely replace in vitro tests by simulation, and at least augment your in vivo tests or in vivo clinical trials by simulation itself. So that's definitely one thing. And like especially if you know like apply like different technologies like AI, or also like this what I talked about earlier, like the statistical shape modeling approach, and connect it with simulation, then you can do, I mean, a lot of things, not only for medical device manufacturers, but also like going into clinicians, into clinics, and bring solutions, which sort of contribute to treatment, also like to, especially to diagnosis, treatment, but also like to on rehab protocols maybe. So those are the things where I see in 5 or up to 10 years that maybe clinicians, especially the newer ones coming now, maybe new in the field, who are sort of affine or like like are more and more interested in simulation or new technologies coming from the clinical side, that you would see that in a clinical setup more easily. That simulation, or at least like in silico tools, are utilized also there in the decision making process.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel it might be the path that engineers took? Like back in the days, obviously we didn't have lectures like on FEA, CFD, and so on and so forth. And at some point, we just had lectures about that. We adopted it as a kind of a basic course that we had to take in engineering school. Do you feel like in the future, like clinicians, for example, will have the same, I would say, path in university, or that maybe
Mm.
if they have to upskill themselves in terms of simulation, how simulation works, and interpreting results, that sort of stuff? Do you think that will become mandatory?
It could be, yeah. Why not? So, because I mean, as they learn about their diagnostic tools, that can become a tool for diagnosis in their specific field. It can also become, at least in treatment selection, an important tool. Like a simple thing, for example, you have a fracture. Now the surgeon asks, okay, which blade I should utilize and where to position it, and how many screws do I utilize? That's an easy question any surgeon has to answer when he goes to surgery or into the operation theater. And those are things I would say can be even nowadays easily resolved by simulation, or at least that like the surgeon has an assisted tool or assisting tool helping him in the decision making. And sure, it would be best for like the trained clinicians, that they know how to understand that, and not only trusting the pictures, but maybe the
Mm-hmm.
process behind understanding the treatment tool or the diagnosis tool. I mean, they have, for example, as lectures, that's the thing I know from Rostock back then, there's implant technology as a lecture, so a clinician can take, and then he would learn about all the implants out there and how they're utilized and what the surgical approach would be and so on. And why not that? Okay, now those are tools available for example, let's say heart treatments, any kind of heart treatments. Those are the simulation tools out there, and this is how you can understand them coming from a clinical perspective with no engineering background, but at least that this is out, and this can be utilized in that way, and those are the limitations also of this technique. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Did we miss anything important, Sven, that you think we should have mentioned in this episode in terms of digital twins, verification, and validation? I think we covered most of the important stuff.
I
Anything
think
else?
I think we went over a lot of topics. So right now I cannot have nothing to add. Let me just think
I mean,
now.
maybe
So
the topic of
uh,
preclinical studies, clinical studies, and then post-market surveillance could be interesting. I'm not sure. Maybe you
mm,
can quickly explain what this is all about.
yeah, so it leads maybe to the idea of like looking on the device over the entire product life cycle, and I would say especially in Europe with the new MDR rules and laws out there, I would say that like especially post market surveillance becomes more and more an issue, because a lot of or the device manufacturers, they have, like generate evidence and objective data out there, or like gather clinical data to see the benefit and the performance promises, I would say, from their devices, and that's the thing they should document. And this is something, of course, I would say also, like from a simulation side, that's something quite interesting, because um, what for example is also like one way to go for is like doing again a clinical study, like a post-market surveillance study or post-market clinical study. And it's something, again, we can utilize simulation as for a clinical validation study, use it for this purposes. And I think I know what we did, for example. That's something we did with a company together, was utilizing patient-specific modeling and simulation to actually highlight the difference between their device and maybe a device out there in the field, like a predict device or a gold standard out there. And then that's the way you can show, yeah, that's the device out there. That's our new device now on the market. And now let's see how they perform against each other. That's something you can wonderfully do, I would say, in simulation, because there you can exactly do those iterations, those parameter studies and case studies without, like recruiting a patient and asking maybe a patient to do things which you cannot do within, like a clinical trial or even in a laboratory setting.
Yeah, this is super cool. Yeah, I definitely learned a lot, Sven. So not the classical mechanical engineering podcast that you hear on a day-to-day basis, but more like how it works from the medical side. I think there are also some things that people need to take care of. And I think even if you're an engineer listening to this, I think you can take away a lot in terms of how verification and validation works and how simulation is being used in the medical space. Any closing remarks from your side, Sven? How people can get in touch with you? I don't know, book a consultancy service, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so I mean, the easiest way to get in touch with us is looking on our website. So there we have, like everything we talked about from the solution side, but also like from the consulting part. There are a couple of pages where, like someone who is interested can look at it. Also, like looking more closely in the aspects we talked about today. And there, of course, there's always a way to get in touch with me right away. So on the website, there's like you can schedule right away a meeting with me in my calendar. So that's no problem. Then we can talk about, like things someone who is interested wants to talk about, for example, about the verification validation process and maybe what we can offer there, but also when it comes to, like doing actual project work. So those are the things we can always sort of, like do for a customer. Yeah.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you so much, Sven. Looking forward to pushing the episode live, and maybe there will be another part in the future.
Yeah, sounds great. So thanks a lot, Yusuf, for the opportunity to talk to you with here. So it was a pleasure, and hope
Likewise.
that it can also serve others in this regard. Yeah, thanks
Definitely.
a lot.
Thanks.
SimQ, we personalize patient care with simulation.